And we're good. Okay, welcome back to session 3 of what's already been a fascinating conference. Lots of interesting discussions thus far. We'll see where our next 2 speakers are going to propel us. One is live in person, and the other is going to be a recorded video that will be played in the second session, or second part of this session. But we will start off with a live presentation by Richmond Eustis, who is Associate Professor in the Department of English, Modern Languages, and Cultural Studies at Nichols State University in Thibodaux, Louisiana. I hope I pronounced that right.
Oh, yeah.
He teaches world literature and studies wastelands, which is awesome. Spends a lot of time in the wilderness as a senior instructor for NOLS in Alaska, in the Rocky Mountains, Pacific Northwest, the Dolomites, the Adirondacks, and Scandinavia. And like I think many of us here, he's been a Star Wars aficionado since things initially started in 1977. And would like to spend time poking around in Tatooine's deserts and Andor forests. Sign me up, because that would be a fun tour to do. So we should talk about that. Without further ado, Dr. Richmond Eustis.
Thanks, Patrick. And actually, I wanted to start by mentioning a conversation I just had with Brian. It's exciting for me to be around political scientists. I'm a literary scholar. One of the interesting things about the presentations today is the sort of elided eye rolls and the promises. Oh, I'm not going to spend any time on this sort of thing. I'm like, no, that's the interesting stuff. I don't know anything about these people. Go back to that slide. I don't know this at all. So thank you all for the opportunity to absorb some of what's being done in political science. It's been really exciting to me. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm going to leave this very cheery ending scene from Row 1. What's up?
That's how we know you're not just
That's right.
You would never go anywhere without them.
Oh no, we're gonna stick with this scene of apocalypse and ending, and as a good philologist, I'll probably clap out some scansion for you and pound on the table. Yeah, we're gonna start looking at language on a real granular level here, in its relation to how certain writers seem to think that rebels should be talking about. So I'll start with the observation that among an array of other functions, both empire and rebellion are machines for producing rhetoric and corpses. And Andor imagines and depicts how they do it. So my purpose here isn't really to talk about revolutionary rhetoric in the world that we inhabit together, but I'm interested in the kind of rhetoric that some prominent rebels employ in Andor series. So the agents of empire speak in this sort of numbing, clipped cadences and euphemisms of bureaucratic efficiency. The rebels varies along some rhetorical, aesthetic, narrative lines. Perhaps the most striking feature of the way the rebels talk is they are wordy. They deliver their worldviews in monologues, often of extraordinary power, but they take the time to set aside and explain exactly what is going on to the other people in the scene and, by virtue of that, to the audience. Think of Loy desperately begging his comrades to escape Narkina 5. We think about Luthen's ode to his own bleak hope in the escape, describing the fate of his soul. Saw Gerrera's call to liberatory madness and violence. Mon Mothma's Senate speech that we were talking about yesterday, marking the sort of public announcement of the rebellion. And Karis Nemec's manifesto that sustains this revolution. Some of these monologues are classical in direction. They're directed to the self or to an immediate audience, and some are they're actually lyrics in the way that they're set up. That is, they're one-sided messages that are meant to be overheard. The closest thing that the Empire gets to a monologue is Mon Mothma's husband Perrin's wedding toast for his wealthy, privileged guests, urging them to pursue joy and beauty in the face of the world's sadness and ugliness. And I don't think he's entirely wrong, but it's not a big step from enjoy yourselves to why fight? It's so tedious and unpleasant. Much of the variance in rebel rhetoric about rebellion is informed by the ironic distance between the reader and the character. No character in Andor knows how their efforts are going to end. There's desperation in Cassian's plea for Mothma to make it worth it, or in Bix's insistence that the rebels have to win if it's going to cost her everything. But we as viewers know how it's going to end for some. We know their sacrifices would be worth it in the collective sense. And it's here the work of the critic Frank Kermode can be helpful. I'm thinking of his work from the 60s, The Sense of an Ending, that he focuses primarily on apocalypse. But he also posits that the ending gives hermeneutic weight to the interval between it and the beginning. He has a sort of famous formulation that that tick-tock is a fiction. Instead of saying tick, tick, by starting it with tick and ending it with tock, now we've told a story. And that's what gives meaning to that interval between. That time has elapsed. And it's a fiction that we tell ourselves to make sense of what happened. So again, in folktale, we see this sort of thing work as well. King Arthur's struggles are already unfolding in the shadow of the ship-bearing battle. Robin Hood's first arrow against the Sheriff of Nottingham is also echoed in the last arrow he fires to his resting place. And so as we're watching Andor, that sort of thing unfolds for us as well. As Kermode puts it, he says, to make sense of our lives from where we are, we're sort of stranded in the middle. We need fictions of beginnings and we need fictions of ends. Fictions that unite beginning and the end and endow the interval with meaning. So we see that there. In Andor, each character's intervention and the rhetoric of rebellion occurs in the shadow of Cassian Andor's fate, which has become, as Kermode explains, nearer to myth, thanks Patrick, than to novel or to drama. That is, Cassian proceeds to the end that we know awaits him. Part of the pleasure in Andor is watching how he gets there. How does he become Andor that we see in Rogue One? So it's a combination of myth with the trappings of realism. Kermode points out the more daring the peripeteia, the more daring the road that we get there fictionally, the more that we may feel the work respects our sense of reality. And the more certain we'll feel that the fiction under consideration is finding out something for us, something real. It's not preordained, and yet it is. So the rebel monologues of Andor take place in the shadow of Cassian's embrace of Jyn Erso as the Empire vaporizes them on Scarab. It's a final act of sacrifice, solidarity, of empathy, of individual loss as part of a collective victory. So I'm going to look at some of these monologues, a few characters that occur in tension with this ending. Characters like Kino Loy, like Luth and Rael, who proceed to their own endings too, but they also proceed to Cassian's ending. So Kino Loy, I guess we'll start with, makes his monologue in One Way Up. That's season 1, episode 10. And he does it over the commandeered microphone in Narkina 5. So his incarcerated comrades are desperately trying to escape this Imperial prison system. Narkina 5 is very clearly the Empire in microcosm. The lies, the surveillance, the exploitation, the mechanisms of impersonal cruelty and violence, the sense of hopelessness, that there's no use in attempting to resist because you will fail. You'll be fried if you touch the live floor. So the lives of the prisoners are subject to physical coercion, but also to non-coerced social reproduction, right? As John Pertevi puts it in Edges of the State. So the external surveillance and physical punishment is complemented by internal policing. Control works best when you're complicit with it. So the empire is a society of control in which everyone's always under deferred judgment and always with conditional probation at best. In the case of Narkina 5, the Emperor's narrative mask of security and progress is stripped from the regime of control, fear, and genocide. So when Kino Loy starts, at first he falters until Cassian looks at him in disbelief and demands on him, "That's what you've got? That's all you've got?" And as so many characters express throughout the series, Loy doesn't know if he's up to doing what's asked of him. He's got to find a way to use his voice to counter the imperatives of empire with imperatives of his own, which he does. So wherever you are right now, get up, stop the work, get out of your cells, take charge and start climbing. Loy's orders directly counter the orders of empire to work, to stay in your cell, to follow orders. As Loy commandeers the microphone, he also assumes the disembodied, impersonal voice of Narkina 5 through the public address system. As he's doing that, as he's assuming the voice of the building, he also subverts by identifying himself. He gives his name. He utters the truth that his fellow inmates already know but can't utter. And the impersonal voice of obedience has become the personal voice of rule. Loy's speech is made in a moment of desperation, but it's so carefully constructed along classical models. He establishes ethos immediately, giving his name and his position. He shouts out the logos of why the prisoner should revolt, telling him who's been fried on what floor and what happens when they're really transferred. And then he sets out, he sets out there the guards, the transfers building. The building is ours. They fried 100 men. Last, Loy sets out Kairos. The moment of action is now, and there may be no other. If we wait until they figure that out, it may be too late. We'll never have a better chance than this. Loy highlights and intensifies not a sense of despair, but a moment of desperate hope and resistance. His announcement, the language is full of verbs. It's a call to action, but also to community, solidarity, mutual aid. He has a sense that any victory will be collective rather than individual. So he delivers most of his call in the second person and in the first person plural. You need to run, climb, kill. You need to help each other. You see someone who's confused, someone who's lost. You get them moving and you keep them moving until we put this place behind us. As it's sort of the empire microcosm, it's also important to note that Loy is not some revolutionary trying to save the galaxy. He just wants his incarcerated brethren free of their immediate oppression of this one manifestation of empire. But Loy's act also shows Andor what that looks like and prefigures the fate in store for him. Loy's enabled the destruction of this node of imperial control and the liberation of his inmates, fellow inmates, but he won't survive it. He won't survive the uprising himself. He'll die trying to take them down rather than give them. Loy sacrifices his life for the flourishing of others, so will Cass. So if Loy is operating in the rhetorical mode, Rael is operating in the poetic. Same episode. Rael, challenged by Lonnie Young, sets out the losses he's endured in the long shadow fight against the Empire. And if Loy's is a model of classical structure, then Rael's is more like a Shakespearean or a Sophoclean monologue. And it's an examination of the sort of cruel optimism demanded by rebellion. The very good that he pursues is the insurmountable obstacle to his ability to thrive as an individual. It's going to demand of him everything. As he shouts at Young, including, he's going to include his soul. He is damned for what he does. Some critics have observed that Rael's monologue is an iambic pentameter, which contributes to the Shakespearean tone and impact. They're not entirely right, however. Rael's monologue is characterized not by iambs, but by where the meter's broken. It's occasionally an iambs, but the pattern is a series of iambs which break down every time Rael contemplates what he's using. So the opening of his apologia, his explanation of his life, begins not with iambs, but with two alliterative trochees flanked by spondates. And so remind you what that sounds like. It's calm, kindness, kinship, love. So we have this calm, kindness, kinship, love. It's a drum beat. And it sets out the list of his descent into the dark arts that enable the rebellion to continue. You hear this again, my anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight. Starts with two dactyls, epic meter, literally epic meter, in a very appropriate parody of ego and thumos, that male fighting spirit. But that meter gets away from him at the end of the line. If we hear my anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, the more he describes what where his flaws are, the more that control gets away from him. He's a murderer and a liar and a blackmailer. He's sacrificed allies, he's terrorized and assassinated civilians. He is condemned to use the tools of his enemy to defeat them. So it doesn't fall on the image of iambic beats, but the rhythm falls on the things that he's lost. The mind, a sunless space. He lives without sunrise, without light, without a mirror to his actions. Any light to his speech comes from the flames of the burning his decency and burning his life. The torment for Rail is that he sees clear-eyed that he's both subject to and enforcer of the microfascisms of Andor. The need for control, the violence, the turning people into instruments. He's clear-eyed about his damnation, and he knows he cannot survive any just rebellion. So his monologue is filled with poetic images you'll recognize: light, sunrise, mirrors, ghosts. His incantatory lines echo those of some Shakespearean magician, a Prospero manipulating people and action from behind the scenes, including those of his own adopted daughter, Clan, and the role of a sort of covert ops Miranda. This quality likely is part of what led many commenters to speculate on Rail's possible connection to the Jedi or Sith. I'm so glad they didn't do that. The magic in Rail's monologue comes like Loy's from a more classical source. It's the voice of the dead. It's the voice of the underworld. Rail's despair, if we can call it that, is for himself. It's not for the future of the rebellion. He knows he'll never live to see that sunrise. But by mastering and employing the arts of the underworld, Rail enables the actions of the above-ground heroes like Mon Mothma and Cassian. So, Mon Mothma, how are we doing on time? 10?
You've got 10 more minutes.
Oh, perfect. So when we look at Mon Mothma's Senate speech, she's back to classical models, focusing on her right to speak. She doesn't even remember a time she hasn't been in the Senate. Focusing on the reason for her speaking, the recent genocide at Norman, and the fact that the monster at the door is coming for all of us. That's her kairos there. Much like, whereas Kino Loy is focused on the specific, the local, the individual, Mothma is universal and abstract. She loves truth. The distance between what's been said and what's known to be true has become an abyss. Of all the things at risk, the loss of an objective reality is perhaps the most dangerous. The death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil. Mothma, too, like Loy, is countering the Empire's regime of lies with an effort to tell the truth. And that makes her continued tenure as senator unsustainable. And it's a good idea, I think, at this point to give some background. The 2025 novel Mask of Fear, which takes place before Andor by about 14 years or so, sets out the early allegiances, kind of uneasy alliances between Bail Organa and Mothma and Saw Gerrera. The text includes two moments that set out Mothma's resistance role in the Senate. The first is in a thought that she has. Saw can fight his unwinnable battles and become a hero and a martyr, inspiring followers who throw themselves against the Emperor's army of death. Bail could keep the flame of purity alive to remind them all and remind the galaxy of what another way could look like. And Mon could levy a tax on arms production here, organize the megacorporations to oust a governor there. She would compromise and walk away tainted, and she would save lives. In a later scene, the Emperor's vizier informs her that her restoration act that is going to put some legal limits on the Emperor is going to be completely ignored. That the Emperor is going to acknowledge that it passed and then not observe it in any way. The vizier tells Mon Mothma that she can go home and claim victory and do whatever she wants. He says, "You're a fine administrator. Please do administrate. But do not attempt to interfere with things that actually matter. You are a pragmatic woman, Mon Mothma, not an ideologue, and I believe you understand this." He tells her, says, "Let me put this matter simply. You've offered up your threats, your portrait of resistance by the corporations, the nobility, the elite of the coddled poor worlds. I think you're deluded, or at best, speaking with unwarranted optimism, but I could be mistaken. So it comes to this. Would you really start a war, Mon Mothma? You? the outspoken pacifist. Of course, 14 years later, turns out she would. To do so requires her to shed her old life and be born again. She drops her Senate robe and literally throws on Cassian's coat. She's been reborn right before Cassian as well. Welcome to the rebellion. Mon Mothma lives to see the rebellion win. Senator Mon Mothma does not. Last, I think it's important to consider rebellion rhetoric and memory. Two important speeches, monologues, in which people keep saying to remember things. The first is Nemec's manifesto, punctuated by the anaphora of memory. Remember this, remember that, and remember this. Right? Moments of, he writes in metaphor, moments of defiance will overflood the river. Like Loy, he gives simple instructions. Remember, try. The remainder is a commitment to truth. The empire is fragile. It's piercing of that veil of imperial invincibility. It's an appeal to reason and to hope. Saw Gerrera wants you to remember things. Saw Gerrera starts his little monologue to Will saying, remember this moment, this perfect night. You think I'm crazy? Yes, I am. The revolution is not for the same. Look at us, unloved, hunted cannon fodder. We'll all be dead before the Republic is back, and yet here we are. Where are you, boy? You're here. You're with me. You're not with Luthen. You're here. You're right here, and you're ready to fight. We're the Rhino kid. We're the fuel. We're the thing that explodes when there's too much friction in the air. Let it in, boy. That's freedom calling. Let it in. Let it run wild. Where Nemec uses metaphor in service of reason, much of Gerrera's speech, it's all metaphor. We're the Rhino kid. If you're not the Rhino yet, you need to breathe it in. It's the call to freedom, it's metaphor, it's madness. If you miss it, the maniacal laugh reinforces the madness for us. It's less a speech than a howl of defiance and intoxication of the violence to come. Gerrera is a long veteran of this war. He spent his years fighting it. 14 years earlier, Gerrera thinks to himself that Mothma doesn't have it in her to stage a coup. I have my own speeches, he says in Mask of Fear. They don't waste as much time, but they come to the same point. If you stand and watch, things get worse. We know Gerrera is right, as viewers of Rogue One. He'll be dead before the Republic returns. He'll be incinerated on his last stand on Jeddah when the Empire deploys weapons and forces Kino Loy and Cassian to build a prison. One more revolutionary will lose everything in the service of collective victory. So, finish. The knowledge here of how this long episode of the story ends informs our reading of these monologues, our reception of these monologues. For many of them, their message in essence is, here's what is true, and here's what to do. But the subjects of all of them is, here's the fate that awaits me. The sense of the ending for Andor matters for these characters because it sheds light on the way certain texts envision the end of Empire. It's a comic myth, in the classical, not the humorous sense, but it comes at great price. And as in many old tales, the voices of the dead warn us of it. Kino Loy is right that there's one way out. They all share Cassian.
What's that? So I have to read more poetry.
Yeah. Everybody should always read.
Hi, everyone. Wars turns out to be a surprisingly, I think, useful case for thinking about some of these questions and debates in the fields and areas that I work in. I want to acknowledge up front that the downside to me not being able to be there with you today is that I don't know how to balance geeking out on Star Wars lore and stuff with actual political science. So I've tried to do a little bit of both in this talk, but apologies if I've fallen short one way or the other. I'm happy to try and make up for it in the Q&A. I want to begin by motivating this question with the question that has driven much of my research agenda, and that's something that I like to call the paradox of opposition. Hey everyone, thanks so much to Walid for organizing this amazing workshop and conference and to hosting. I wish I could be there with you all in person. My name is Daniel Tavana. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Penn State. My work is mostly on authoritarian institutions and the politics of opposition, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa. Star Wars turns out to be a surprisingly, I think, useful case for thinking about some of these questions and debates in the fields and areas that I work in. I want to acknowledge up front that the downside to me not being able to be there with you today is that I don't know how to balance geeking out on Star Wars lore and stuff with actual political science. So I've tried to do a little bit of both in this talk, but apologies if I've fallen short one way or the other. I'm happy to try and make up for it in the Q&A. I want to begin by motivating this question with the question that has driven much of my research agenda, and that's something that I would like to call the paradox of opposition. I outlined this in a few articles that I've written, as well as a book manuscript that's forthcoming. But the central idea, I think, and it will be one that's familiar to most people, is that autocrats use nominally democratic institutions, specifically legislatures, parties, elections, to solve problems, right? Specifically elite and mass challenges to their rule. But we also know that these institutions create really powerful arenas sometimes where oppositional actors can coordinate, build networks, communicate shared grievances, and do all kinds of things. And so in my work, in my book specifically, I describe what I call endogenous opposition, or oppositions that are essentially made through these institutions or within them. And so I think this is puzzling for a variety of reasons, but most specifically because, at least in the authoritarian politics literature, the kind of conventional wisdom, the longstanding wisdom, which I think is slowly starting to change, is that these institutions in non-democratic regimes tend to help dictators solve a lot of these problems. Turns out sometimes that's not always the case, and our theories for understanding when and why this happens are not very good, right? So that's the big kind of political science question that I'm thinking about. Now, when it comes to Star Wars specifically, I want to use the events of Andor, but really the events that preceded Andor, for the most part, to kind of explain how something very similar happened in the period leading up to the events of the rebellion, A New Hope, and after. So what I want to argue today in this kind of half-baked argument that I'm kind of thinking about in the context of Star Wars and my own work and a couple cases, specifically Kuwait, that I know pretty well and study, is that the Imperial Senate, which was refashioned as a cooptative institution 19 years before the Battle of Yavin, endogenously generates the rebellion that eventually topples the Galactic Empire, right? Prior to the Rebel Alliance, the emergence of what's called in Star Wars lore the Delegation of 2000 is a very formative event in this transformation. We see the delegation in Andor kind of at the very, very end of its kind of time. But actually, in the very beginning, after the Clone Wars, it was far more powerful. And that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature on authoritarian institutions and opposition, but not much. Talk about the case, the delegation, and imperial consolidation. Again, those of you who are familiar with Andor specifically will kind of know some of this. Maybe some of it will be new. And talk a little bit about the implications, like how institutions backfire and what are the consequences of that for some of the things that we care about. So first, very quickly, I think existing work in comparative politics, I'm a comparativist, kind of gives us a very good place to start thinking about opposition more broadly, right? Scholars generally view elections or institutions as a means by which dictators hold on to power, right? And they do this through a variety of mechanisms: credible commitments, signaling, monitoring, distributing patronage, acquiring information, right, and so on. We see all of these kinds of things in the empire in Andor, right? But even before. This is not to say that we don't really know when oppositions or oppositional actors succeed. We know that where there are permissive institutions, right, oppositions sometimes do comparatively well, where they have access to resources like private capital or labor organizations, they tend to do well. We know that there are some like mixed findings when it comes to repression. Repression sometimes hurts, sometimes it helps. We also know that coalitions are a big part of opposition success. And again, on the top row, you kind of see all of these things with the empire, right? But on the bottom, you see all of these things in different ways with the opposition, right? The kind of nascent rebellion. Resources, critically important, right? Repression has this, double-edged effect. It backfires, but sometimes it can kind of force people to be quiet. And then coalitions, right? The kind of famous division between the radicals of the partisans and people like Saw Gerrera versus the more pragmatic Mon Mothma and to a lesser extent Bail Organa, which we'll get into. Why Star Wars? I think in a lot of ways, Star Wars it's like an unusually clean case for examining what I call in my work endogenous opposition or how opposition emerges, right? We have observable institutions. We have a very detailed canonical record of Senate procedures, membership, debates. We have a very clear counterfactual. Palpatine dissolves the Senate before the Battle of Yavin. We observe its rise and fall as an institution, but also the empire kind of writ large. We have a very rich textual record. Of course, Revenge of the Sith, Andor, Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear, a book that I think is really important to understanding the story I'm going to tell in a little bit, which I'll talk about, right? We also have traceable mechanisms because, of course, it's a work of fiction and because there are movies and books. We get to see inside the delegation in ways that we don't really get to see other oppositions. We don't really get to see, like, the Turkish opposition, for example. We don't really get to see their infighting in, up close and personal. We hear about it, people talk about it, but of course, because it's Star Wars, because it's fiction, we get to actually see it, sometimes on camera, sometimes in books, and so on. And so that's really kind of fun to think about, whether or not in the real world these things happen as we look to the case as a sort of mirror, right? I want to give a sort of overview for those who may be unfamiliar with the period of Star Wars that I'm kind of talking about and most interested in. Again, this might be kind of a bit boring for many of you. You can think of these periods as like VDEM codings, right? So we have the late Republic before the Clone Wars start. We have electoral democracy with very weak horizontal accountability. Lots of corporate corruption, right? The Trade Federation takes Naboo. There's nothing done about it. Eventually, there's the very famous scene, I think it's in episode 2, where it's like, oh, the bureaucrats are stepping in, right? There's a lot of this going on. We also have judicial overreach, which in the case of the late Republic is actually the Jedi, right? Doing a lot of things that are unaccountable. Of course, in the interest, they say, of democracy and of preserving the Republic, but ultimately giving it sort of fodder to decline. We have a period of emergency rule from 22 to 19, executive aggrandizement via the Emergency Powers Act and Reflex Amendment specifically, right? You can think of this as like democratic backsliding. It's in this period, under the pretext of war, that all kinds of emergency measures are being taken in order to consolidate Emperor Palpatine's, or sorry, the Chancellor Palpatine's power, right? Culminating in the end of the war and what comes after. At the end of the war, we have what I would call the Imperial Senate era. And this is pretty much, in my view, as I read it, this looks like a lot of the political regimes that I'm familiar with in the Middle East. Competitive authoritarianism, Senate is retained, but opposition becomes increasingly costly over time, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. Right? You can think of maybe the Imperial Senate era as something like, Hungary under Viktor Orban, or Turkey under Erdogan, right? And then, after that, the period where we have episodes 4 through 6, we have closed authoritarianism. The Senate is dissolved very famously. I think it's Darth Vader who tells Princess Leia that this is actually happening at the moment, right? Direct rule through the Moffs, something that starts much earlier, but is sort of coming to its peak around this period. By 19 BBY, the emperor is sort of like a personalist autocracy with military scaffolding, right? Built through legal rather than extra legal means. But it is still relatively weak, right? This is not the empire that exists, right, in A New Hope. It is deeply popular. The emperor is extremely popular, but it's still relatively weak. It's trying to negotiate a sort of reintegration of the separatist worlds, particularly in the outer rim. It's trying to deal with this opposition that's a nuisance in the Imperial Senate. Palpatine doesn't really have all the military apparatus. He's dealing with rogue Jedi in different parts of the galaxy, those who escape Order 66. So it is still a relatively weak political regime in a lot of ways. As I said earlier, I kind of see the Imperial Senate era as sort of like hybrid rule, competitive authoritarianism, which we would call this in political science. Coercive institutions exist uneasily alongside the Senate. In Andor, you kind of see the logical conclusion of this when the coercive institutions begin to become far more powerful than the Senate, right? But in the beginning, right, how did we get here? There's the sector governance decree in 19 BBY, which installs imperial appointed Moffs over senatorial oversight, who are going to be able to intervene directly into different systems and different forms of planetary governance in ways that completely render the Senate, in some ways, irrelevant. Right? ISB and Imperial intelligence are stood up as these sort of redundant surveillance channels. We see again in later stages in Andor what this kind of looks like in practice, right? But in the beginning, these are still sort of new. These are things that the emperor is setting up in order to kind of consolidate his power. And like many intelligence agencies, again, particularly in the regions that I study and I'm familiar with, the ISB and the Imperial intelligence don't always get along, right? They have different purviews. They fight a little bit. Imperial intelligence is sort of like military intelligence. ISB, which eventually kind of becomes more dominant, stronger, is sort of like a police force, right? And so that's another kind of aspect to how the emperor in this period is consolidating his power. We have the Inquisitors who are running around the galaxy, eliminating the Jedi as an alternative armed authority, right? You can kind of think of some of these Jedi who survive Order 66 as like a pre-rebellion rebellion in a lot of ways. Not all of them are active. Some of them are trying to hide. Of course, we know the famous cases, Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? But others are kind of doing stuff, as we see. But again, not a lot of them are. Economic control. The Trade Federation is nationalized, later abolished. Banking clan, techno union, right? The behaviors of these different independent economic corporations were a major cause of the separatist movement and the Clone Wars themselves, right? But in this period, the emperor is taking over these institutions. The Imperial Defense Recruitment Bill, 15 BBY, facilitates the clone to stormtrooper transition, right? Creating a military force directly loyal to Emperor Palpatine, right? All of this looks like the consolidation of authoritarianism, just as it would in lots of other places around the world, right? But this is sort of what I see as the kind of main, some of the main things that are happening in this period. All right. Let's get to the delegation. This is a very famous Revenge of the Sith deleted scene. Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Padme Amidala, Gideon Danu, Tertanil, Fangzar. These are all senators who are part of the Imperial Senate, right, on the eve of the Clone Wars when it's ending, right? And this is a deleted scene. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may not, but it's actually not in the movie if you watch it, right? Now, Organa starts, now that he has control of the Jedi Council, the Chancellor has appointed governors to oversee all star systems in the Republic. When did this happen? The decree was posted this morning. Do you think he will dismantle the Senate? Why bother? As a practical matter, the Senate no longer exists. The Constitution is in shreds, amendment after amendment, executive directives, sometimes a dozen in one day. We can't let 1,000 years of democracy disappear without a fight. What are you suggesting? I apologize. I didn't mean to sound like a separatist. And then Mon Mothma, very powerfully says, we are not separatists trying to leave the Republic. We're loyalists trying to preserve democracy in the Republic. And so that's sort of the beginning of the delegation. It consists of about 2,000 senators, many from the Loyalist Committee. These were the senators who were originally Palpatine's biggest defenders, right, during the separatist crisis, pushing Valorum out in the events of the prequel movies. It's organized in 19 BBY in response to the sector governance decree, which I talked about, and continued use of emergency powers. It consists of Bail Organa and Mon Mothma, primarily Padme Amidala as public spokesperson, although, of course, she passes away relatively early on in this part of the story. They meet in Bail Organa's office, Cantham House meetings on Coruscant, private senatorial apartments. These are kind of behind the scenes, right? And we see them as like a loyal opposition. They're operating within a constitutional framework, within the limits of the system. They're not seeking regime change. Point I'll come back to in a little bit. The delegation's first move is to issue what's called the Petition of 2000. And this petition consists of 4 demands. First, return executive authority accumulated since the Separatist crisis, Clone Wars, abrogate the sector governance decree and the MOF system, reopen negotiations with the Confederacy of Independent Systems. This ultimately kind of happens over the course of the story anyway. The independent systems who leave the Republic are starting to come back over the course of a series of negotiations, restore senatorial prerogatives stripped by executive and Moff appointments, right? Oops. Aftermath. So before the petition is released, the Imperial Senate consists of fence-sitters who privately doubt Palpatine, right? Even though he's very popular. This is the kind of deleted scene we see in Revenge of the Sith. There's this pluralistic ignorance, as it's called in the comparative politics literature. Nobody really knows who else is in, right? Who opposes Palpatine. He's extremely popular, right? His later acts, which we'll talk about, generate even more popularity, which he's able to kind of use and manipulate. But at the same time, the institutional levers are rapidly degrading, right? This functional democracy, as I kind of hinted at earlier, is beginning to disappear. By the end of the Clone Wars, we have the Battle of Kashyyyk, Order 66, and the proclamation of the New Order, which is the Emperor essentially destroying the Republic and making himself the Emperor. All 2,000 signatories are investigated. Half withdraw their signatures. 63 senators are detained. Some are released. Some are disappeared. And then the petition kind of becomes irrelevant, right? The whole point of the petition was to advocate for reform within the context of the Republic. Now the Republic is dead. And so now there has to be another kind of move here as to what will come next. Some of the senators exit, some stay, some defect entirely, right? Many of these events are discussed in Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear, a really amazing, interesting book that documents this entire period of the Imperial Senate. And so if you like Andor, I would highly recommend reading this book. It kind of takes the 15 or so years before the events of Andor begin in 5 BBY and kind of talk about what life is like in this hybrid regime where the Senate still exists, the Emperor is weak, right? And things are still kind of being hashed out. How the opposition challenges the Emperor, I just want to go over these very quickly. There are two sort of fronts, right? The book documents exactly how Mon Mothma is pursuing reform within the system, legislative reform, drafts a bill to legally constrain Palpatine's emergency powers, rallies the surviving delegation members, builds this cross-cutting coalition of idealists, reintegrated former separatist worlds who are still not thrilled with the war's outcome, some corporate magnates, even criminal interests, right? The coalition holds, but eventually the bill dies. Very famously in the book, Mothma says no amount of political support can constrain Palpatine legally anymore, right? At that point, it becomes impossible to use the institutions to challenge Palpatine. At the same time, Bail Organa is sort of like obsessed with figuring out what really happened behind Order 66, right? And he's pursuing, he's using legal tools in doing so often in extra legal ways, because he thinks that exposing the regime's foundational lie, right, which is that the Jedi wanted to usurp power for themselves and kill the Emperor, will mobilize public opposition, right? And these two tracks exist kind of uneasily with each other, leading to many conflicts between Mothma and Bail Organa. Some of them, of course, you see kind of playing out in parts of Andor. Like many oppositions, the delegation is divided, which has consequences for its success, right, and influence in the system. The Empire kind of governs through ISB and Imperial intelligence, as I said. ISB agent Heki runs surveillance on Bail Organa, cultivates informants, including Mothma's aide, Juna, an ISB plant, and Chemish, a relative of Mothma's staff. Pro-Imperial activist group, the 4040s, carries out violence with regime backing. At one point, Mothma's apartment is broken into, Juna is killed. Mothma is detained and interrogated, released after publicly affirming loyalty to the Empire. So if you're interested in the intelligence, right, the surveillance side of this period of Star Wars history, the book is incredibly rich with this kind of parallel story, in addition to what's going on with the Senate, showing how these different agencies and groups are kind of surveilling and monitoring each other in this environment where kind of both sides are equally powerful or influential. It's not really clear, even though the emperor is popular and has the upper hand, that he'll come on top, right? This is, of course, why the emperor is so obsessed with the Death Star, because the Death Star is sort of the thing that will eventually allow all of this opposition to sort of back off, or so he thinks. I want to talk a little bit as I kind of wrap up on the delegation's impact on the rebel alliance, right? So, as I said earlier, the events of this period have a profound impact on how the rebel alliance eventually takes shape, right? There are a few things I'm kind of thinking about and want to draw attention to. The rebel alliance is not a revolutionary movement. This is in part a consequence of its institutional origins, right? Mothma eventually leaves. She goes to Yavin, right? We know the rest of the story. And you can kind of compare this like with South Africa versus Iran, right? In South Africa in 1994, ANC kind of takes over. It takes over the state in some ways, right? Versus Iran, where you have a completely new revolution. Rebellions inherit the coalitional dynamics of their founders. Quality of post-victory governance is shaped by these coalitions, right? You can compare Tunisia and Egypt, for example. The Troika government in Tunisia, which governs liberals and Islamists govern in the transition period together, whereas Egypt, right, it's a little more, it's primarily the Muslim Brotherhood who's responsible, of course, with the military in this period, without many allies. Loyalist origins are kind of limiting, right? Structurally incapable of grappling with the possibility that the Republic itself was part of the problem, right? So we can think about this in a variety of cases. The Philippine people power transition succeeds in the 80s, I think 1986, right? But ultimately, what comes after are a set of elite families that are kind of the ire of Duterte and his populist movement moving forward, right? And so thinking about the delegation and the rebel alliance in this way, I think are really important, right? I am already at 25 minutes, so I want to just kind of wrap up very quickly. A few interesting extensions, things I'm thinking about: system versus anti-system opposition, comparing the delegation with Hidden Path, Saw Gerrera's partisans, specters, right? The dictator's dilemma: overwhelming intelligence advantage breaks down for the empire due to sycophancy and poor planning, right? Even until the last minute, the emperor in episode 6 thinks he's going to be successful. Why, right? And then core versus periphery dynamics. I think this is a kind of classic question, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity to talk about a few of my favorite things at the same time, which is a bit weird and strange, but looking forward to your questions if there are any. Thanks.
Kylo Ren marching around. We will pull ourselves back to the Andor present, as opposed to our journey into the future for the Last Jedi. So two fascinating and stimulating presentations, and we are now open for some Q&A. Jen, get started.
Richmond, that was amazing, and I want to thank you for like bringing together my two deep passions, sci-fi fantasy, and sort of like thinking about lyrics and music, right, and like how these things work together. So I was really sort of struck when you said at the beginning that these messages are delivered in monologues and they're lyrical, right? They're sort of one-sided and meant to be overheard. It's like, oh my God, mind blown, this is amazing. So I was wondering how much is that lyrical pacing, do you think, like learned? And when we look at the real world, how does it vary potentially across cultural or social settings, right? I was thinking sort of about the Western 7-note scale, right? The Asian pentatonic scale, sort of the way that jazz intertwines flats and sharps and minors and major scales. And when you mentioned saw, and your reading of his speech was amazing, I immediately thought of jazz.
Yeah.
Right, and how there's that sort of irregular pacing that may seem at first informal and sort of unrefined to those not in the know, right? But that's actually sort of like revealing this deep beauty and untruth. And so I'm wondering if you can just expand a little bit on like that lyrical and spoken, yeah. It was amazing. I like, yeah.
And especially because it's not acid jazz, it's radio jazz.
Right, that's exactly right. Which, probably is, have some overlap there, right? I don't know what a rhino high would feel like, but it seems pretty intense. Yeah, I think one of the things that the writers do well here is approximate that oral improvisational quality that is neither fully oral nor improvisational, but it feels that way. What particularly I love the Saga talk to Will for a lot of reasons, but a lot of it is because he's playing. I love that you brought up jazz because I think he's playing variations on a series of themes that we've already seen.
Yeah, for next.
Oh, yeah. That we already know. The Rhino as the super dangerous jet fuel. The way that you become the Rhino is that you let it in. And as an audience, I suspect we're supposed to be sort of riveted but horrified at the same time. What is this madman doing to Will? What sort of strange baptism, drug-induced baptism is Will undergoing here? And do I really want to be a witness to this transformation? The only way that we can not be a witness, though, is to turn it off. And we don't really have that option either. So as long as we want to hear this story, we're going to have to bear witness to what the edges of revolution do to these. And I think that's it's in love lyrics. It's a lovely thing to overhear sometimes. I mean, anyway, I'm about to get way off topic. Sometimes it's a very nice thing to overhear a love lyric. Sometimes it's a very scary thing, and a feeling of intrusion, but you're bound to it and not allowed to step away.
Dan, do you want to say a few words?
No, I think I'll just say listening to myself talk for 25 minutes was extremely painful. But I think there are a lot of connections to Jen's presentation earlier, which I just really loved. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, Daniel, you should have delivered your talk in broken iams, and then if you were just able to do it rhetorically the way Richmond discusses, then that would change the change the.
I felt like it was just really slow. I don't know if that's how it recorded or what, but I don't talk that slowly in real life, or maybe I do and I just don't know it. But
You don't.
No, by no means.
Okay, do we have a question from the Zoom?
Yeah, I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
I was interested in the talk about opposition. I've noticed I'm in the U.S. I noticed that it seems that in a fascistic government that the opposition party can represent their constituents at the same time as not really getting anything, accomplishing anything. And in the meantime, they have very good, they get to enjoy their position of being a senator or congressperson or whatever. And I'm wondering if that's something that you see in the world of Andor and Star Wars.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I kind of glossed over this, but one of the really interesting aspects of what Mon Mothma, I think, is trying to do in the book is she's trying to put together this legislative coalition of all kinds of different actors. And at times she kind of like mocks them. She's very skeptical of how truthful or honest they are. And so she's sort of I don't want to say she's like the well, I was going to say Joe Manchin, but Joe Manchin is was kind of like a Republican. But for her, it's like whatever it takes. We need a legislative coalition to get this done. And at one point, Bale, due to his like obsession with Order 66 and the Jedi, like Mon Mothma in a meeting of senators kind of tells him like, "Shut up! The Jedi are super unpopular. The the Emperor is in control of the propaganda apparatus." Nobody believes or thinks that the Jedi are innocent, even if they are. Stop talking about the Jedi. There's no point. And so you kind of like get this sense reading the book that Mon Mothma is this pure kind of pragmatist, right? But amongst a lot of the other senators that she has to deal with, there's a lot of exactly that going on, like what's actually in it for them. She's sometimes trading kind of favors to those constituents. I mean, it works just like a real kind of Senate, and in that negotiation process you see some of exactly these dynamics play out, which if you follow politics in the US closely, you kind of see. But even in other cases where there's like a dictator who's kind of powerful at the top and an opposition that's very divided and feckless, you see a lot of these very same dynamics. And as I mentioned in the presentation, what's I think uniquely fascinating is like you don't really get to see the opposition meetings in the real world behind the scenes with them yelling at each other, right? Sometimes it spills out into the open. But you do see it in Star Wars in all kinds of interesting ways that reveal exactly these kinds of dynamics.
Great, thanks.
I love that book. Yeah, it's a good. Master Fear was really well done. It's a really nice novel.
Did it say that it's a series?
Yes.
Okay.
The second one is coming out in September. So you can pre-order it now at your favorite bookstore. So
It's kind of a funny novel because it's so much procedural.
Yeah.
It's so much like, well, can I get this senator on board?
Right.
Can I?
Like the West Wing.
Yeah. What do I have to say to this senator to get him to like?
They need Star Destroyers in my district.
That's exactly,
Yeah.
That's 100%.
it's exactly.
Well, there's also like interesting pacing in the dialogue of the West Wing, right? Like that's part of the brilliance of the whole story. So like there's a kind of interesting connection there.
And you've got Saw on the edge going, when do I get to blow something?
When I have to bolt about exactly. Daniel.
And I think that's the question I kind of want to ask you. That piece and the Kermode piece, right? So, I mean, I think you're right. Like the sort of the tick tock. And the point is that actually the clock is really not. It's just whatever it's you that's making that sound different, right? And so what Kermode is not quite saying, right, is what Adorno was saying, right, which is that you're not really reading the story is reading you. The music knows you, the art knows you, right? The Copernican turn, right? So the genre is telling you. And I wonder where you come down on that, because I think that's sort of what's at stake with the rhetoric, right? Like if I start doing my dactyl respondees and I fall out of meter. In one genre, that's a sign that I'm not the person I'm claiming to be, right? I'm not a real senator. If I was a real senator, if I had really gone to Eton and Oxford, but there is nothing that you could do that would get me out of my calendar, right? And that's how you know that Malvolio isn't really ever going to marry Olivia, right? On the other hand, you can look at that and think, wow, he's really authentic. Like, every time Donald Trump makes absolutely no sense at all, right? It's not that he's making no sense at all. It's that he is leading with his heart, you see. And I am gaining immediate access to another person's soul. Like Hillary would never give me that, right? And you can then argue that that person is projecting meaning onto that person, which of course they are. But there you go. There's your art knowing you. But in either case, it's the same. That's the same trope, right? Falling out of meter, right? And so then is that not really about what ideologies I'm bringing to the party?
Can I get related? You want to jump on that?
Yeah, because it's interesting what people, I think it makes a ton of sense that there's so much focus on Saw Gerrera, in part because there's gonna be variation on this, but out of the rebel leaders that we see over the course of Andor, if we're thinking about Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, we see Drevon, and then Saw Gerrera. And he's actually the one who's like of the people. Like the reason he's rhino poisoned is because he was in prison and inhaled the fumes, right? It's an industrial accident. Like he's labor, and he talks convincingly like a leftist. Like you hear jazz, I hear a leftist.
Interesting.
Like I hear American University of Beirut, like 1952 style leftist. But so what I'm interested in is how like and there's the Eton language, there's also like the French expose, but like how the order operates. So I'm curious how you see these different layers of like different ideologies speak in different ways. Like Hassan Nasrallah was famous for speaking across multiple registers of, of dialect Arabic, right into Quranic Arabic, into modern standard Arabic. So I'm curious how you sort of read those in Andor across different characters or different bases, because I'm clearly talking about this from the rebel side, but there is also the empire side, right? And I don't know if there's a linguistic framework that is like that we specifically associate with fascism, because I can hear leftist and I can sort of think of what I would hear if I'm hearing fascist, but then there's obviously variation there.
I love that you asked this question, because as I was putting, and I'm going to also address the TikTok question too, and I hope I don't sound glib when I say, when I think about the interval between the beginning and the end, I think in a sense beginnings and ends are arbitrary. Where do we stop the tail? Well, you stop the tail where it stops. Do we stop at the end of episode 9? Maybe. For purposes of Andor, do we stop at the explosion of the first Death Star, the second, at Andor's death? The ending that this is something I didn't get into in a bit, just because I was going to get super nerdy about it. But the ending that we choose also has an effect on the way that we read the present of that character. So it's not just choosing talk. It's which talk do we pick?
Well, right, each one gives us the same thing, right? That is to say, lots of things can be the last line of the play. The question is what feels like an ending, what feels satisfying.
Exactly. And I think when we're talking about how we read those monologues, or how we interpret rebel speech within that framework of, when I have this moment in the interval to express myself, or to express myself in a way that's going to be overheard, first of all, who am I really talking to? And I think that's an open question for a lot of those monologues in Andor. I think there's more to be said in that interaction between Young and Rael, where this is, Lonnie asks him, well, what do you even sacrifice? Like, you have a super cool starship and nobody ever can figure out what's going on with you anyway. What do you even sacrifice? I mean, Young has to know what Rael sacrifices, or at least in part. So is Rael talking to us? Yeah, in a sense, yeah. He wants us to know. He wants the overhearers to know what he's given up. And so his register is that of someone who's I mean, he speaks in poetry. He speaks in verse and in elevated language, not elevated in complicated vocabulary, but in image and in rhythm. And I absolutely agree with you about Saw. Yeah, I think he is both leftist and jazz. And I love the sort of, I think one of the moments that your question gets at is this sort of backhanded shade he tosses. Like, well, you're not with Luther. You're here. You're ready to fight. You're not going to hide in the shadows like a spider anymore. You're with me. Hail freedom. And that switch from Luthen's explanation to Claire of like, yeah, we're already in the fight. That means we keep losing until we don't. And Saw saying, no, we get to win sometimes. And here's how you start. It's he doesn't speak at all in terms of strategy. He speaks in terms of beautiful perfection, this beautiful night that has you here ready to fight with me.
Yeah. And I want to connect this over to Daniel's presentation, because the emphasis on the kind of Saw Gerrera strain of the rebellion, shall we say, complicates the story Daniel's telling about the delegation of 2000, which I don't think is a wrong story, but it's a partial story, because the rebellion has many origins. And admittedly, I think Daniel's right, but it's not a revolution. It can't be a revolution. You can't have a revolution in a fantasy world because there's a moral right answer. Ontology says you can't have a revolution. Right? But as a rebellion, you've got sort of the procedural coalitional stuff going on in the Senate and with the senators, but then you've got this Saw Gerrera kind of like raw energy that's also kind of part of this. So it complicates the story in all kinds of interesting ways. So trying to do a full analysis of the origins of the Rebel Alliance is going to have to overspill any of these analytics that we're bringing onto it, because you've got these different strains that are sort of idiosyncratically configuring to produce the thing we're finally seeing, which I think is kind of cool.
That's why I love that Mon Mothma quote that I gave from Ask a Fear, which is let Saw Gerrera go and blow things up and be a martyr and whatever he's going to do, and let Bale do his fulminating thing in the Senate. And in the meantime, I'm going to save lives by passing insurance regulations. And people are going to call me compromised, and I don't care.
And that's the whole, you need all of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else from Dan?
No, just to add very quickly to that, I think my perspective is that like successful revolutions or successful oppositions, even if they're fighting within a system to kind of overturn executive overreach, as the Imperial Senate is trying to do, like you need both. You need a Saw Gerrera, and then you need somebody who works in the system. It's the existence of the other that makes each one individually all the more powerful, right? But that being said, a rebel alliance that's led by Saw Gerrera rather than Mon Mothma probably looks very different, right? It probably pursues different goals. We don't really, to Sarah's point, we don't really get too many glimpses of Saw Gerrera's ideology. He's not super, he's not all in on the Republic, and he does praise it a few times, but the backstory to Saw is, of course, fighting separatists with the allegiance of the Republic, and then the Republic kind of betrays him. And so it's not really clear. I kind of read him as like a leftist. My reading is that you need both of these in order for any one individually to be credible. Saw Gerrera just going around blowing things up is not really going to do very much in the long term, absent something in the system that's pushing. And in the same way, something in the system that's pushing is going to be irrelevant if there's no kind of realization on the part of the empire that if you push it outside the system, then you have all-out rebellion, which is ironically exactly what happens on the eve of A New Hope. and again, the empire has already by that point for 20 years allowed the Rebel Alliance to kind of take shape. Kind of, I don't want to say by accident, but it's certainly understanding the Rebel Alliance as a consequence of what was happening in the Senate in this period, I think is an important part of the story that, unless you've read the book, doesn't always make immediate sense.
It's the same dichotomy we were talking about with Brian's presentation, right? With you have the speakers, but you also have goods. And you kind of need both. And it's that tension-filled sort of dichotomy that becomes the really interesting thing. And if nothing else, then we're certainly talking about the fact that Star Wars is very clearly representing. So I think we're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Sorry I couldn't be there.